There was a time when Germany had a thriving Black community, fluent in German, deeply rooted in German soil, and even part of the cultural elite. Black intellectuals, artists, soldiers, and citizens walked freely through cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt. They weren't outsiders. They were Germans. But today, their names have been forgotten, their stories silenced, and their communities erased. You won't find their faces in school books. You won't see their legacy in German memorials. And most Germans have never been taught what really happened, because the truth is darker than most are willing to admit. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of migration or economic hardship. It was a systematic erasure carried out by laws, enforced by violence, and sealed by silence. Black Germans were sterilized, banned from marrying, expelled from schools, and hunted under Germany's racial codes. Not in colonies, on German soil. So what happened to the Black Germans? How did one of Europe's most advanced nations make an entire race disappear without leaving a trace? In this video, let's find out. The history of Afro-Germans is not a modern tale. It stretches back over 4 centuries, beginning not with migration or refuge, but with conquest and commodification. In the late 17th century, as European empires carved up the African continent in pursuit of wealth and supremacy, the German state of Brandenburg-Prussia entered the fray. It was then that the Brandenburg African Company, a state-backed enterprise, was formed in 1682 to compete in the lucrative Atlantic slave trade. This company established Fort Gross Friedrichsburg on the Gulf of Guinea, which is now the coast of Ghana. Although German colonial expansion came later than that of the British, French, or Portuguese, the ambition was no less violent. German ships like the Friedrich III regularly departed the West African coast, their human cargo tightly packed, dehumanized, and bound for Caribbean colonies such as St. Thomas, then under Danish control. But not all these enslaved individuals remained in the colonies. Some were rerouted to Europe itself, and that's where the foundations of an Afro-German presence began. Unlike Britain or France, Germany did not have a wide diaspora of former colonies settling in the metropole at that time. Instead, the first Black people in German lands were often seen not as citizens or workers, but as status symbols. Wealthy aristocrats and royal households acquired African servants as a mark of sophistication or to show off their imperial reach. A disturbing example occurred in the 1680s, when 12 African boys were presented as diplomatic gifts to Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg, also known as the Great Elector. These children were dressed in elaborate outfits, adorned with golden chains, and paraded through the Prussian court as human trophies. They were not raised as Germans, nor were they truly educated or integrated. They were exoticized, objectified, and placed on display, a chilling precursor to the human zoos that would appear across Europe in the 19th century. As time went on, some Africans gained more permanent roles in German society. A number of African men were conscripted or employed as soldiers and guards. Others became intellectuals, translators, or diplomats, positions made possible by missionary contact, colonial bureaucracy, or trade. During the 18th and 19th centuries, a small but visible Afro-German presence developed, especially in port cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin. These individuals often lived precarious lives, caught between cultural invisibility and exotic curiosity. Their presence was tolerated, not celebrated, not welcomed, and certainly not protected. Yet by the time Germany lost its colonial holdings in Africa after World War I, including territories in Cameroon, Togo, Namibia, and Tanzania, the already fragile position of Afro-Germans deteriorated rapidly. Deprived of a colonial justification for their presence, many Black Germans were cast adrift in a society that no longer saw political or economic value in them. Their rights were uncertain, their identity unrecognized, their future increasingly bleak. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Afro-German history. While Jews were the primary targets of Nazi racial ideology, Black Germans were also seen as a fundamental threat to the racial purity of the so-called Aryan race. At the time, it is estimated that 2,000 to 3,000 Black people lived in Germany, a mix of African students, diplomats, entertainers, intellectuals, and children of colonial or post-war interactions. Among the most vulnerable were the mixed-race children born in the Rhineland after World War I. These children, whose fathers were often African soldiers from the French colonial army stationed in post-war Germany, were viewed as a humiliating reminder of military defeat and racial pollution. The Nazis gave them a derogatory label, Rhineland bastards. This term was not merely an insult, it was a death sentence. Hitler's Mein Kampf made his views clear. He considered these children a betrayal of German blood and accused the French of deliberately using primitive African troops to disgrace the German population. The solution, in Hitler's eyes, was erasure. The Nazi regime began implementing racial policies with surgical precision. Although the Nuremberg race laws of 1935 initially targeted Jews, they were rapidly expanded to include any group deemed non-Aryan, like Roma, Slavs, and Black people. Afro-Germans were stripped of German citizenship, denied access to education and employment, and barred from marrying or having sexual relations with Aryans. They were surveilled, harassed, and in many cases, sterilized. The sterilization programs were among the most horrifying. Without consent, and often without full understanding, many Afro-Germans, particularly the Rhineland children, were forcibly sterilized in hospitals or taken from their families under false pretenses. These procedures were meant to prevent what the Nazis called racial contamination from spreading further into the German population. It is estimated that hundreds of Afro-Germans were sterilized between 1933 and 1945, though precise numbers remain unclear due to the deliberate destruction of records. But the persecution didn't stop there. Some Afro-Germans were imprisoned in concentration camps, where their treatment was as brutal as it was dehumanizing. Others were murdered outright. Yet despite this unimaginable cruelty, traces of resistance endured. Some Afro-Germans went into hiding. Others escaped abroad. A few managed to survive by concealing their identity, marrying into white families, or being sheltered by allies. Germany in the 1930s wasn't just marching toward war, it was engineering a future without those it deemed unfit. And for Afro-Germans, that meant vanishing, not through public executions, but through silence, law, and scalpels. The horror began with the Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases, passed in July 1933, just 6 months after Hitler came to power. Though presented as a scientific and medical measure, this law was, in truth, an act of biological warfare against people who didn't fit the Nazi vision of racial purity. This wasn't a fringe policy. It was implemented with brutal precision. Special hereditary health courts were set up across the country. Judges and doctors worked hand in hand with Nazi authorities to determine who should be sterilized. Between 1933 and 1939, over 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized in Germany. And while most were disabled, mentally ill, or otherwise labeled undesirable, Afro-Germans were quietly swept into the process under a separate, even more sinister logic: racial elimination. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. Afro-Germans, especially mixed-race children born to African fathers and German mothers, were cast as biological threats. These children, often fathered by African soldiers, embodied everything the Nazis feared: a visible dilution of Aryan blood. Not only were they denied a place in society, but they were also denied the right to exist as part of Germany's future. Their sterilization wasn't just a physical attack. It was a deliberate assault on identity, legacy, and belonging. Some of these procedures were carried out in hospitals, others in prisons. Parents weren't always told the truth. Children were sometimes sent under false pretenses for medical checkups, and returned unable to have families of their own. Girls as young as 12 were sterilized. Boys were threatened, restrained, or bribed. There was no consent, no appeal, no future. A particularly heartbreaking case is that of Ferdinand Allen, a young Afro-German boy born to a British black father and a white German mother. He suffered from vision problems, a condition that Nazi doctors used as pretext to declare him genetically unfit. In 1941, Ferdinand was sterilized by court order. That might have been the end of his trauma, but the Nazi machine had more in store. Later that year, Ferdinand was murdered under Action T4, the covert Nazi euthanasia program aimed at eliminating not just the disabled and mentally ill, but also anyone deemed racially or biologically impure. He was one of thousands, vanished in secrecy, without a grave or acknowledgement. Between 1939 and 1945, an estimated 275,000 people were murdered under the T4 program, including the physically disabled, mentally ill, epileptics, and children with deformities. Afro-Germans were not officially listed in T4's categories, but they were targeted under special suborders issued to sterilize or eliminate racial anomalies. Some were sent to facilities like Hadamar, Grafeneck, or Sonnenstein, where they were starved, poisoned, or gassed, their deaths recorded as natural causes. These were not isolated events. They were part of a coordinated campaign to disappear Black Germans, not necessarily by lining them up and shooting them, but by stripping them of lineage, community, and visibility. First sterilize, then isolate, then erase. If sterilization was biological warfare, Germany's legal system provided the scaffolding for cultural annihilation. Afro-Germans were not just denied the future, they were denied the present. Under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, any non-Aryan, including Black Germans, was banned from working in public service. Teachers, nurses, mail carriers, and clerks were dismissed en masse. And the message spread fast. Black people were not just unwelcome. They were non-existent in the eyes of the state. Education? Black children were often forbidden from attending school altogether. In rare cases where they were allowed, they were seated at the back, barred from extracurriculars, and sometimes beaten by teachers. They were called racial slurs, spit on, ostracized. By adolescence, most dropped out or were removed under racial hygiene policies. Employment denied. Afro-Germans were pushed into the shadows, performing in nightclubs, cleaning toilets, or working on black markets. Black entertainers, who had once flourished in Weimar Berlin, were now silenced. Clubs were shut down. Musicians were banned. Black actors were barred from the German film and stage, not because of their talent, but because of their skin. Marriage? Outlawed. Interracial marriage and sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans were criminalized under the Nuremberg laws. White German women were forced to divorce their Black husbands under threat of imprisonment. Pregnant women carrying biracial children were shamed, coerced into abortion, or declared mentally unfit and institutionalized. The entire concept of love across race was branded as treason. But it got worse. Besides erasure and marginalization, Germany had other tactics to dehumanize Black people. Human zoos were one of them. These were not fringe events, they were mainstream entertainment. Starting in the late 19th century and peaking in the early 20th century, over 400 such ethnological exhibitions were staged across German cities, from Berlin and Hamburg to Dresden and Cologne. Africans, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous Americans, and Asians were shipped in, dressed up in tribal costumes, and forced to perform for German audiences who paid tickets to stare, mock, and marvel at them. They were often placed in mock villages, built with palm fronds, mud huts, and wooden fences inside zoo grounds or city parks. Attendees watched them cook, dance, fight, and even bathe, all for the illusion of observing the primitive in its natural state. For many Germans, this was their first real-life encounter with Blackness, and it was designed to reinforce white supremacy. Posters would advertise exotic warriors from Africa or wild tribes from the colonies. Children were brought on school trips to see the savages. They were taught not empathy, but distance, that Africans were different, inferior, even amusing. It wasn't just about watching Black people. It was about dehumanizing them until the crowd no longer saw a person, just a prop in a colonial fairy tale. One man who bore witness to this era was Theodore Michael Wanja, born in 1925 in Berlin, to a Cameroonian father and a German mother. His father was one of the many Africans forced into these shows to survive. He danced, wore leopard skins, and pretended to be uncivilized for German audiences who laughed and clapped, not realizing or not caring that he had once been a respected soldier in the German Imperial Army. In his memoir, Deutsch sein und schwarz dazu, being German and also Black, Theodore recalls watching his father act out a degrading caricature of African life in order to feed his children. There was no dignity, he wrote, only spectacle. Even as a child, he knew something was wrong, not just with the way his father was being treated, but with the way his own existence was being consumed as entertainment. Human zoos were not only a public humiliation, but also state-sanctioned racism. They were organized with official permits, promoted by the press, and in many cases, endorsed by scientists who used them to justify theories of racial hierarchy. These exhibitions blurred the line between zoo and ghetto, and in doing so, laid the social groundwork for future atrocities. Because if a society could normalize watching Black people in cages, how far a leap was it to sterilize them or eliminating them? By the end of World War II, Germany's Black population had not disappeared in a single moment. It had been systematically erased through sterilization, exclusion, forced migration, and social invisibility. Those who remained lived between silence and stigma, often unsure whether they had the right to even call themselves German. And yet, they endured. The story of Afro-Germans is not just one of pain. It is one of survival against a national effort to forget them. From human zoos to sterilization wards, from Gestapo raids to neo-Nazi murders, Afro-Germans have persisted, not as relics of the past, but as living, breathing proof to resilience. Today, Black Germans still face racial profiling, discrimination, and invisibility in mainstream German narratives. Their history has been buried under decades of silence. But silence doesn't erase the truth, and the world must know not just for history's sake, but for justice. Because the moment people forget their past, they become vulnerable to repeating it. So next time someone tells you Germany never had a Black population, ask them, why then was it so thoroughly erased? Tell us, if Germany could erase its Black population so thoroughly, how many other nations have done the same without ever being held accountable? How many modern Germans even know that sterilization, apartheid-like laws, and public lynchings happened to Black people in their own cities? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on whether the silence surrounding Afro-Germans was part of the plan all along to make it seem like they never existed. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.